with devious dungeons, foreboding forests, and the coolest cats. My name is Phil, and welcome to the Dark Orb. Hopefully, I've got an interesting show for you today. I'm running Symbaroum, my favourite RPG, for the first time in about 6 weeks. So I thought it would be fun to go through the turmoil, challenges I've gone through in just trying to remember where we are since the last game, and also to remind myself of what's happening in the campaign, who my party are, and all that sort of general stuff that we all go through as games masters and as role players as well. So please, if you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe, follow, all that sort of stuff. You know, the buttons down there. I don't know. Whatever you feel like, really. We are live, so please also, if you are watching, feel free to throw in your comments, any questions. Let me know what you go through when you're dealing with this. It's always a challenge. So let's start. What is Symbaroum? Symbaroum is a role-playing game that I've grown to love over the last year and a half. I originally bought it thinking it was going to be an alternative to Dungeons and Dragons, which I've never really loved. That's that sort of dungeon crawler game, and certainly that was my impression when I first picked up the core rulebook. Turns out that's really not accurate, and if you watch any interviews with the creators, such as Matthias Johnson-Hawker, you'll find out that it's much deeper than that. It's a political game. It's a game about morality, about rights and wrong, about greys within that. It's about making those decisions that you really don't want to make, and the consequences, not only for your party or for yourself, but for the world around you. My my experience of that is quite an interesting one in terms of just looking at how the party goes, and looking at, let me think of a way to explain it, looking at how the party changes over time, because they might come in sort of gung-ho, particularly if they're from a more straightforward system like Dungeons and Dragons, where you can jump into any sort of combat and pretty much be guaranteed to survive. And instead, you're thrown into a situation where you're pretty much guaranteed to have your character die unless you think carefully and you work together. Our campaign has been running for nearly a year and a half, certainly a year and a quarter, and we're currently running the Throne of Thorns campaign. There have been some injections of other scenarios in order to get from point A to point B, for example, and I'll go through that in a bit. But yeah, primarily we're doing that published scenario. Hello everyone who's joined so far. Hi to Krista, to Sanjiro, and to Neil. Good to see you. Thank you very much for joining. Yeah, so we've actually taken the path of going from the Promised Land, which is the scenario that's in the core rulebook, and we've gone through that, which is a journey through the Titans, which is the mountain range at the bottom of the map. Spoilers, apologies in advance if you've not played at all. We then used something called the Curse of the River Goddess to get from that area up to the Forest of Davokar through along a river on a boat. Then we jumped off the boat, came down through the bottom of Davokar, and I kind of story waved that a little bit so that they didn't die en route, and because I was feeling a bit sort of impatient, and landed at Jakad's Heart, which is Blight Night, which is one of two scenarios, the other being the riverboat scenario I've just mentioned, called the Curse of the River Goddess, that you can find in Adventure Pack 2. Adventure Pack 1, sorry. From there, we then travelled over to Thistlehold. I made a judgment call of where Jakad's Heart could be, and decided that it would be a few days to get from there to Thistlehold. And with that, we picked up Mark of the Beast, which is the second story in the Copper Crown mini campaign, which is started by the Promised Land, which is in the core rulebook. After that, we then picked up Tomb of Dying Dreams, which is the third story in that mini campaign. It's a campaign of 3 stories. You can find those PDFs on Drive-Thru RPG. getting it in print is really difficult. It took me a while. I did manage it. You end up with this book here. Let me see if you can find it. It's that. I was very lucky. I paid about £25 for it, which is actually quite a lot for that. But it's quite hard to find. I suspect they're probably going to reprint it in one way or another at some point. The Adventure Pack 1, which is here, actually comes with one of the GM screens, and I'll come back to that in a bit. After that, we decided to start Throne of Thorns. It was a bit of a consultation with the party to check that everyone actually wanted to progress and do the campaign, because the campaign is huge. It's going to get to 6 or 7 books. It was represented on my shelf here so far. So that's 4 books already. And I'm pretty sure that the 5th book is on the way. It's going to be probably hitting Kickstarter or pre-order at some point in the next 3 to 6 months, I would guess. That's normally the release cadence. So yeah, that's where we are. We've just finished Act 1 of the scenario stuff that's in that book. Yeah, exactly, Neil. It's really hard to find. I sat on eBay for a few months, basically. I think I ended up setting up a like an alert for the Copper Crown, and it just popped up and I had to buy it immediately. But yeah, it's a real challenge to get hold of the Copper Crown. But you can get it on PDF, and that's better than nothing. Where were we? Yeah, so we've just finished Act 1 of the Wrath of the Warden, which is the first part of the Throne of Thorns campaign. That is represented by this book here, and I'll come back to this in a bit. The party themselves, my home group, consists of 3 players plus myself. We have a human barbarian ranger. He's obviously specialised in range attacks. He's beginning to get into the idea of doing more stealthy things and stabbing people in the back and stuff now, as we get into much more close quarters combat. That character's called Darren, and he's played by my friend Duncan. And we have another character, Vivalex, Goblin Fighter, sort of modelled on Vivian from the Young Ones, and he just has 0 tact for anything, runs in, stabs and hits things, and doesn't really care about whether it's the right thing to do. That's played by Erin. And we have an Ambrian sorcerer who's very much finding her feet. She doesn't really want to be a sorcerer. She has this power and she doesn't really know how to control it. She really wants to find a way to become educated and maybe find a path, be it witchcraft or wizardry, if she can. That's played by Stuart. Those 3 players can be seen in the Free League Showcase game that I did last year. Unfortunately, I had some really horrible technical issues on my side, but I think the game still, for the most part, is pretty watchable, and it was good fun, and that was a scenario that I wrote at a much higher level. So you can see in that game how dangerous your characters can become once you put a lot of XP in. And that's something to be really careful of as we take people through the campaign. We also had another character called Riolana, who was a changeling barbarian witch. Unfortunately, the player who was playing that character, my friend Kai, had to drop out. It's a real shame, but that character hopefully will reappear at some point. Yeah, so that's where we are right now. There's quite a lot of story there, and it's taken us actually about a year to get there, which is a disproportionate amount of time. That's because we're a very roleplay heavy group, and I do encourage that. I think it's really important to focus more on roleplay than metagaming, and it also makes it easier to understand the decisions that were made if they're made by the character. It's kind of hard to explain. I'm sure as GMs and players you will get that. That also makes it easier to recap, because in the event that you have something that's happened that wasn't recorded, it's much more straightforward to think about what would that character have done. Okay, that's why that happened. In terms of XP, we're actually only at about 40 XP. I really hold XP back in my games for Symbaroum, and the reason for that is, as I mentioned, Symbaroum gets quite unbalanced at higher levels. And at that point, you have to mitigate the fact that your players are really deadly by throwing more enemies at them. The more enemies you throw at them, the harder it is to track, which is fine. I think when you're playing using a VTT or you're playing in person, it's a little bit more straightforward. Playing online, it's a different story, really. It's quite hard to really keep track of everything if you don't want to use a VTT, and I prefer not to. I just feel that when you're using a virtual tabletop, and they're great products, and I do use them occasionally, but for something like Symbaroum that's lore heavy and more story focused than necessarily combat focused, with story driven games, really, you end up in a situation where you can kind of lose the feel, you can lose the narrative flow because you are more focused on where your character is on a map rather than what they're thinking and how they're feeling. And personally, I'm more interested in the narrative arc. That is something that Symbaroum is really, really good for. Excuse me a second, I need a drink. And this, unfortunately, is not alcohol. So, what do we do in terms of planning? It's worthwhile checking which books you're working from and making sure you've got the right ones in front of you. So, for me, where I am right now, the most important books for me are the core rulebook, which is here. And as you can see, I've actually tagged all of the pages here that I find, all the sections that I find are relevant. And that's actually more useful than you'd imagine. The amount of times that I rely on that, especially as I play more and more, and as my players or NPCs come up with powers and abilities that I haven't encountered before. If players level up and they take something that you haven't really used much, being able to get to that area in the book is really useful. It's also really useful to have the PDF for that as well, because you can then control F or whatever key combination is appropriate for your PDF viewer to find that part of the book much more quickly. But I prefer paper. The other reason I prefer paper is if you're actually running a game online, you kind of want to keep your video window as open as you can. That means that you can actually still keep an eye on your players and see how they're reacting to the story that you're telling. It's way different in person because obviously you can make the eye contact and it's much easier to then direct the flow. But when you're actually running a game online, you have to pay a lot more attention of those visual cues. Exactly, it's the way forwards. Yeah, that's actually something that my other half started. She's running Dungeon Crawl Classics and she's like tagged everything, and she we were playing 5th edition D&D, we weren't running it, and she tagged both the player books, which are like there. There's like a whole bunch more upstairs, but this is a kind of representation of how often we play those games. And she was right, and I had to do it. So yes, for me, core rulebook, super important. It's got everything you need. Also, it's got a rough presentation of the main areas that your characters are going to be in. So when you're picking up the campaign for the first time in 6 months or 6 weeks or 2 years or whatever, starting with a core rulebook gives you a really nice brief introduction into the area that you're going back into. So even if you're doing something like a homebrew scenario, actually checking first in the core rulebook for the brief synopsis of the area you're going to, be it the town of Thistlehold or the Carvosti, the barbarian stronghold, is really, really handy to kind of pull your brain back in. We're running the Throne of Thorns, and we're actually in Act 2 of the Wrath of the Warden part of that. So, obviously, Wrath of the Warden book's really, really useful for that. Also, in this particular scenario, or in this situation, this book, and I'll go through the naming convention in a second, actually has a sort of subheading or pre-heading of Thistlehold. Wrath of the Warden is actually pretty much entirely set in Thistlehold, and quite a lot of this book, let's see how much of it, the first I'm just looking through. Yeah, pretty much the first 50 pages or so is all lore around that area and the NPCs that inhabit Thistlehold. It's actually really, really useful because it helps you to understand all the politics. As I said, it's a really political game, and everyone in Thistlehold and everyone in the world that Symbaroum inhabits has their own agenda. It's really hard to keep track of. I should probably write notes and do mind maps and all that sort of thing. I don't do that at the moment. It's a challenge. So understanding where your players are going to be and trying to get an idea of the people that they're going to be interacting with is really, really useful. It's something I need to do better. Fortunately, right now we're kind of only playing once a month, although this month's an exception. So I can do that kind of what we call brain dumping a little bit less intensely. It's probably the best way to go with it. So Sandra recommends that we need a forthcoming episode on how to tag your books. Yeah, I could do that. That should be quite fun, actually. And quite a lot of experience. My Coriolis book is done as well. Alien I haven't done yet because I've only run that a small handful of times. But it's such a useful thing to do. And hi Millie as well, whilst we're at it. Right. If you're not running the campaign, if you're actually running homebrew stuff, then I recommend a couple of other books to throw into the mix as well. That would be the Monster Codex, which it's like your monster manual for the actual Symbaroum universe, and it's, amongst other things, it's just super pretty, and this won awards for its layout and its prettiness. Highly recommended. The Advanced Player's Guide is very good as well. And the fairly newly released Games Master's Guide has quite a lot of information about randomly generating things. So it's very useful if you're going out exploring. It pulls stuff out from various different sources and assembles them in a really great way and adds some more information about how to really do it well. The Advanced Player's Guide is actually something that's really worth talking about. I made a decision to effectively ban it from our campaign until after we finished Wrath of the Warden. The reason for that is that it's got some really, really potent abilities and mystical powers that massively overpower your characters, in my opinion. That can kind of detrimentally affect the threat level of your game. Be careful with it. You don't have to do that. I was contemplating it, and then we actually started playing, and one of those abilities basically broke the game and made everything super easy for everyone, because that character could just basically go on a rampage and do whatever they wanted. As we've gotten through the campaign now, and the enemies have scaled up in difficulty, they're beginning to actually get to a point where things are dangerous for them. But for the first 6 months of the campaign, they could pretty much cakewalk anything if they really wanted to. And it was that point that I had to really push them to think about their character's motivation to make up for it, which is really difficult, because you don't want to actually hamper your players. Players are super important, and it's really, really vital that everyone has fun. But it's something to bear in mind. What else do I use? So actually, I've got the card decks, which are here. The card decks are great. The Abilities and Powers card deck, and I'll pick this one because it's nearer, and I'll probably throw the other one on the floor if I tried to grab that one instead. The card decks basically have the abilities and the powers, the main monsters from the core rulebook, I think some from the Monster Codex 2, but I'm not 100% sure on that, and the monstrous traits. And it's really useful if you know that your players are going to be coming up against enemies with specific abilities, specific traits, to actually have those in front of you. So what I tend to do is I'll tend to go through the deck when I've got a generic NPC that they're going up against. So like a creature, for example, or an unnamed assailant, like, a generic ruffian of some description. See whether or not the card for that exists in the deck. And for example, Goblin Warrior, here we go. This was taken out at random. Hopefully that will focus. There we go. That gives you an idea of the Goblin Warrior's stats. Vitally also has their weapons and their tactics and their traits and abilities. If you then also can find the traits and abilities cards, and if no one else is using those traits and abilities, you can actually tag them together. You can use a like a paperclip or something like that, just to hold those cards together in front of you in such a way that then when you're going up against them, you have everything that you need to be able to remember how they're going to behave. It's not infallible. You occasionally get little printing errors, as you do with all books, I guess. So you have to make sure that you understand what's on the card, and it's not complete. There are some abilities, there are some traits, there are plenty of enemies that aren't in those card decks, but when they're there, it's really, really useful. What I also tend to do is get some reference sheets. So I've got a few of them up here. These are things I've printed out that make things easier for me. First of all, character sheet. Really useful to have a character sheet that basically tells you everything that your players are looking at. It's much easier when you're in person. Playing online is a lot more difficult. So having a character sheet in front of you so you can remind yourself of where they should look to pick up, for example, what their equipment is that's on the back. Or if you're kind of going against one of those attributes and you just can't quite remember what the word is, refer to the sheet, particularly if it's been 6 weeks. That's going to happen for me later on when we actually play our home game. There's some other things that I find really useful. A couple of websites I'm sure you all know, Ordo Magica and the Iron Pact. Both of them are really, really useful fonts of information. And they have some great sheets, which are very, very, very worthwhile grabbing. You've got the Monsters and Melee sheet, which literally just has explanations of some of those monstrous traits. Things like qualities of weapons and how they impact play. Armor types and that sort of thing. Situations, conditions, and corruption. So this actually has some really interesting things about how you can use your abilities in opposed roles for the situations that your characters might be in. An example is if you want to sense whether or not you're being watched from afar, then you roll your resolute modified by the opponent's discreet. Yes, I had to double check that. So yeah, really useful at a glance. The vital one, which is obviously straight from the player's core rulebook as well, which is quick combat and death saves. Super important because there is combat. Where we are at right now in the campaign, I don't foresee too much combat, but it's a really, really swingy game. Neil, yes, I completely agree with you. Symbook is really good for that. There is another Symbaroum app as well that I've completely forgotten the name of right now, but there are two Symbaroum apps, certainly on the iPad and the iPhone, iOS, that are really, really useful for looking things up. I like having things printed out. I don't know why I prefer that, and it's not because I like killing trees or anything like that. I think it's just because then I know that it's going to be there. I don't have to go and look for it. I don't have to turn it off and on. I don't know I don't have to worry about it not being on the screen I left it on. Some apps, they kind of reset when they haven't been looked at for a while. But yeah, those apps are super useful, and particularly as a player as well. If you've got those apps to hand, it's sometimes easier than certainly if you can pick a selection of the abilities or whatnot and favourite them. It's much easier sometimes than looking in the book. But two more things that I find really useful. The Symbaroum experience spends is really handy. I don't hand out a lot of experience because my players quite often hoard experience. That's beginning to change now. And as they spend more experience on things like rerolls, I'm more likely to hand it out. This is really handy because you have things like perfect defense, so parrying or dodging a successful attack for an XP. Ignoring corruption, super useful. You can't always do it, but it's fun. It's really, really, really useful. Ah yes, Krista says Symbaroum unofficial. Should have guessed that really, shouldn't I? Excuse me. Right, what else do I really find useful to grab, particularly after a long period of time. Printouts of your NPCs. If you've got a new NPC that they're going to meet, particularly if you've got stat block, it's really useful to print that out. And then again, you can attach those cards to it. If you've got the PDF of the cards, you can even actually put those into the PDF, take a screenshot, add the other things from all the different cards or from other PDFs where you have the abilities and the traits, etc., onto that page, put them all together, print them out, or print them to PDF and have them on your screen. Very, very useful. I do that with allies as well as with enemies, and the reason for that is it just means that I don't have to worry about having all the information to hand or not. If I'm not going to need it now, I might need it later on. They may meet that character again, and certainly you can then file them in a ring binder or whatnot if you really need to, by shoe size or inside leg measurement or name or some other arbitrary value. PDFs and images are good as well. As I said, I don't use virtual tabletop. I will use a virtual tabletop if we've got a large battle happening and if it's really important to work out where everyone is. And certainly if you're playing in person, I would use minis. But online, I'm trying really hard not to use a VTT. I did use one, well, I used Arkenforge for a while for tracking where everyone was when we were playing Mark of the Beast. It was handy, don't get me wrong. But again, I want this game to be a psychological game. And it's hard to be a psychological game when you're wondering how many squares you are away from the enemy. I'd much rather hand wave that in order to maintain threat and peril. And unless you're dealing with a pitched battle or a really large fight or, something ridiculous, it's kind of easier to just try and keep track with notes and a notepad and, showing the map. So with that in mind, having a location map is useful. An example of that would be, let me see here, I've got one here. So from Blight Night, we've got Jackad's Heart. And yes, you can, if you like, put this into a VTT and have your counters. No problem with that. But I find quite often just saying, here's the location, you guys are, down by the gatehouse, which is at position 1. In the event you need to break that out and actually start annotating and you've got something like Zoom, which you're running on, then you can actually annotate straight on the screen. But obviously the moment you take that map down, all your squiggles are going to be there anyway. So then they're going to appear on whoever's on the screen. That said, I still prefer it to using a VTT personally. We'll probably end up using a VTT for 1 or 2 battles later in this part of the campaign. But for now, Theatre of the Mind is just great for me. Documents as well, handouts. So if you've got notes, handwritten notes that are supposed to be delivered to your party, it's really useful to have those as screenshots that you can show up. But for both the maps and for the documents and handouts, it's also worthwhile having a mechanism to send them to your players. So if you're in a messaging group, then sending them the files there. Or alternatively, if you're using something like Zoom or StreamYard or something, having a like a OneDrive or a Dropbox or something like that, where you can just link everything that's for that scenario and say, hey, these are what you need, and put them in the order that they need them, and you just need to trust that they're not going to open them. That's probably the easiest way to do it. GM screens are a useful thing to have. I don't really use them much anymore. But Symbaroum does have a couple of GM screens available. You've got the newer one that came with Symbar, the latest book, which is just looks like that. This one's actually okay once you get to a certain level with your party. I'm going to show what's in there, and hopefully the camera will pick it up. But it's more about excavations and exploring ruins and things like that. And it's good. It's not really relevant for my group right now. What I prefer, if I am going to refer to GM screen, is actually the first GM screen, which is this one here. The artwork is subtly different. Like so. What's good about this GM screen is that it's got some more relevant information, not a lot, and it has got some typos of basic rules. It's got some combat rules and that sort of useful stuff, and some information about things like armor and travel times, etc. I'd agree with friend of the show, Andy, XCS Dev. I agree. Neither of them are great. I find that older one, the second one I showed you, is better. If not for any other reason than it comes with, I'll just put those back. It comes with Adventure Pack 1, if you're lucky. That one there. Adventure Pack 1 has got the Curse of the River Goddess and Blight Knight. Blight Knight, lots of people love, and I actually don't enjoy running. I've only run it once, and I think the reason why I didn't enjoy it is because I'm going to spoil a little bit here. If you're going to play Blight Knight as opposed to running it, then stick your fingers in your ears, and I'll do the old signal when I'm done. Blight Knight has many goblins basically doing an attack on this inn, and it's really hard to manage if your party decides to split. And that's what happened in our game. So everyone ended up in a different location. Everyone had only got about 15 XP each, so they were super squishy, and everyone nearly died. And to be perfectly honest with you, the most deadly member of the group decided that their character was a pacifist and they didn't want to fight. So that really was a challenge. I did end up helping the party a little bit in order to not get a TPK. Some people would argue that's probably the boring way to do it, but I really wanted the party to actually progress and to turn it into a campaign. And that early on in our campaign, it probably would have just ended up with everyone saying, screw it, I'm not playing anymore. So that's what we did. Yep, exactly. Blight Knight sucks like a Dyson. I'd agree with you there. A lot of people love it though. A lot of people really enjoy that scenario. And I know it has been rewritten a little bit. There was a, what do they call it? Like a quick start, which is available as a PDF, and it's got a slightly rewritten version of Blight Knight. And that's what I ended up running from, actually, as opposed to from this. It was still pretty painful for me. Curse of the River Goddess, though, is really useful because that gives you a boat and a trip along a river. So for me, as I was taking the party from the bottom of the map to Davokar, it was very useful because it gave us a mechanism to get from the bottom to the top. From the bottom of Ambria. My brain's gone. Yeah, basically up to Davokar from the mountain range. I haven't got a map to hand to show you, so I'm not going to. But yeah, that's very useful. It also has some stuff about exploring treasure hunts in Davokar, and it's useful for that if you want a way to just throw something in for your party to go exploring in a ruin and see what they get. It's quite handy if you've failed to prep anything. And that comes with the GM screen, as I said. So I will pop that back up there with the GM screen for now, as my Symbaroum wall kind of collapses slightly. Neil says it was one of our best standalone scenarios. Yeah, I think if you have a party that actually manages to stick together and knows what they're doing, and probably if they're established, it's much easier. At this point, we actually had an extra player because it was before the aforementioned character, that player had to unfortunately leave. So we had a larger party, but just for whatever reason, they all ended up in different areas, and because it was so fragmented, it was really hard for everything to kind of be balanced and controlled. And Christy says, used the River Goddess several times as a transition scenario. It's just so useful for that, isn't it? I really appreciate having that there as an easy way to get up to Thistlehold, because the book kind of implies that you have to go through Yndaros, because that's where all your kind of immigrants land at Yndaros. But Copper Crown is a 3-part mini campaign, and the second part is in Thistlehold. So unless you really want to take your time, which you can, and go to Yindaros and kind of look around. And Yindaros is a city east of Thistlehold and slightly further south, so it is kind of in between where you end up at the end of the Promised Land scenario and where you would pick up the Copper Crown trilogy if you wanted to do that. But it's kind of challenging to actually transition there when you know they're supposed to go through some form of immigration because they've just travelled from further south, and then you know they're in a great big city, which if you're like me and you really want to present a good story, you then feel obliged to learn. Now the challenge with that is that the first scenario in the published campaign is also in Thistlehold, not in Yindaros. So you would end up taking your players to Yindaros, then to Thistlehold to actually complete the Copper Crown, and then staying in Thistlehold to then do the part 1 of the Throne of Thorns campaign. Then, when is it? 2 books later, you come back to Yindaros, because you have Carvosti first with the Witch Hammer, and then you come over to Yindaros. So for me, I'd rather put off learning as much as I can about Yindaros until we actually have to go there. There's a lot to learn. It's a very lore-heavy world. The other thing I like to do with my scenarios is, depending on what's going on, to actually try and add a little bit of sound effects. So I have a Sirenscape account. I also have some music files from Plate Mail Games, and there are plenty of other ways of getting music into your game. It's harder to get the balance right when you're playing online, but it is possible. So for example, hopefully if I fade this in, so hopefully you guys can hear that. That would be the music that I would have always when we're in Thistlehold. And I will take that into a different kind of music if we're doing something investigation oriented. So for example, there's some suspenseful music that you can put on in the background, which is fun. But it's difficult because you have to get the balance, the audio balance right. So I've got no idea right now with my setup whether or not I'm too loud or too quiet. I would rely on my players to tell me. And then when something kicks in like this, it can be really overpowering. So that's really challenging, and you have to be really careful to communicate with your players, particularly when you're doing something online, because your audio experience is not the same as everyone else's. In person, you can set it up. I've got speakers up here and up here, and I can hear whether or not it's too loud. So that's much easier. Exactly that. That's my point, Andy. You just can't tell, and it's really hard to know that until you're playing. And that was my point, because from here, that sounded quite quiet. And when you're actually in a game and you're actually playing something that you really want that impact for, having the music too loud or indeed too quiet can actually really break the experience. Let's have a look at the comments. Question coming up in the next, coming into this. Rephrase your question. I'm not following it, Mr. Sanjuro. Yeah, Indurus is off limits. Yeah, and it's the same with the Advanced Player's Guide. I'm holding that off. Andy says route it through a virtual mixer. I'm doing that. I'm routing it through a hardware mixer, and I can hear both. But you don't necessarily know that what you're hearing is okay compared to everyone else. You just don't, because everyone has different tolerances, and it can be a real challenge. And you think that you can, because you can see the levels, that therefore it's okay. And you think that because you can hear your other players and yourself, that it's going to be okay. But the truth is that it's much harder to gauge online compared to when you're playing live. And it's much, much harder playing, putting that music on live on a stream than it is to do it in post-production. So if you're producing a podcast and you want to put music in, it's probably actually better to record it without any of it and then just add the music afterwards. Starter one shot instead of the current quick start one. Actually, I prefer, as a starter, I prefer the Promised Land, which is in the core rulebook. The quick start one, I think, is Blight Knight, and I'm not a huge fan. The core rulebook's Promised Land is great. When it doesn't actually throw you into the forest, it throws you into a mountain range that you're travelling through. If you're confident that they might actually want to do the campaign, and if you can explain that this is a different location to where you're going to end up, then it works quite well. The Promised Land has got a little bit of everything. It's got some investigation, it's got some action, it's got some politics, it's got some moral choices that need to be made. I think it's quite a good representation of the game that's coming. It's just not the game that you think it's going to be. Neil suggests the River Goddess. Yeah, equally good. It's good fun. I enjoyed River Goddess a lot. My only issue with River Goddess is with the enemy, which I think is kind of mundane, to be honest with you. It's got some magical elements, but read it. You'll see what I mean. You'll either love it or hate it. But the actual story itself is great fun, and I've run that scenario a couple of times, and everyone really loved it. Also coming up is the starter set. Treasure Hunts of Davika, I think, was the working title. Hoping that we're going to have an announcement on that really soon. It's been a while. They kind of shared a screenshot mock-up of it 2-3 months ago, before Christmas anyway. So I would anticipate that that's going to be announced anytime now as an official thing. The starter set was... so there was a starter set for Alien, which came out as a boxed product after the cinematic starter kit that was a PDF that you got if you'd pre-ordered the book. There was a starter set for Tales from the Loop, which is super popular, and there's going to be a starter set for Symbaroum. What the scenarios are like, I couldn't possibly say, but hopefully that's a really good way to kind of throw your characters into the deep end. I would speculate that maybe those scenarios aren't going to be attached to the campaign. Judging on other starter sets, it will come with pre-gens as well, I should think. So it's going to be quite good for just getting an idea and a feel for it. But I would probably be inclined, if that's the case, to steer clear of actually making it, getting your players too attached to those characters. I think that it's better to then actually create your own characters for Symbaroum, just so that you can learn how the game breathes and how it develops, and take your characters through the moral choices and that kind of personal growth that pre-gens in Symbaroum might lack. So, picking up the game after a long hiatus. Where do I start? Well, I've had 6 weeks off. For me, I reread the geography, politics and law of the locations that I'm going to. So in this case, Thistlehold is where we're at. I picked up the core rulebook again, reread the section of Thistlehold in that book. It's only a few pages, didn't take very long. I then picked up the Wrath of the Warden book, which is the book that has the campaign that we're doing. Each of those books, as I said, has a location on it as well, and quite a few pages on that location. So whilst we're in Thistlehold, it's relevant to pick the Thistlehold book up, reread that, try and get as much of that into your head as you can, particularly in the areas where they're going to be. We're going to be here a while, so it's really important to reread that a few times. That hasn't all sunk in, to be honest with you. I've forgotten quite a lot of it, so I'm going to have to reread it again. Rarely we're actually having 2 games this month. One's tonight in about an hour. Unfortunately, they're not streaming. I'm not streaming those at the moment. Maybe at some point in the future. The other one's next week. So hopefully I'll be able to pull that in and actually remember that. It's not going to happen. Let's face it. You know, work is busy. Real life is busy. There's only so much that you can actually suck into your brain, and unless you're a superhuman. And if you are, then I'm impressed, and I'm very, very jealous. I'm actually running 2 or 3 different games at the moment, so, and different campaigns. So different systems even and different worlds. So it makes it much more difficult for me to just remember this one location and the lore and everything in there. Um, yeah, reread everything you can about the location that you're in. Then reread the scenario, reread the actual campaign that you're doing. Not all of it, but certainly the last 2 or 3 sessions worth. The reason why that's important is because it helps you to remember not only the story, but hopefully the feel that you had during that game. So, were your characters in peril? If they were, how did you, as a GM, feel about that? Were you actually really worried for their survival? And were you thinking about maybe making the game easier for them so they don't survive? Were you actually the opposite? Were you thinking now would be a really exciting time for one of these guys or girls to perish? And how can I push that without actually breaking it? How can I encourage something world changing or game changing to happen? And how is that affecting the dynamic of the group? Maybe they're investigating something. Have a think about whether or not they were successful, how it made them feel, and whether or not you need to pull in an NPC to help them out so that they can progress with the story. Rereading the last 3 or 4 sessions in terms of what was published is actually really useful because it helps you to reframe that. Oh wow, Krista says 15 months since I last played Symbaroum. Dude, I'm sorry. There's not much else I can say. That must be really hard. And Andy, this is with relation to remembering everything. No need to bow. Well, I've got backache. It's been a long day, and I'm an old man, so I wasn't really bowing. I was just stooping. Andy, yeah, 14 months since Andy's played. Play more. Play more. It's a great system. Many of you probably know it's my favourite system. What can I say? I like that sort of morality issue. It's interesting to put your characters into your players into challenging positions and seeing whether or not they resort to combat or diplomacy or both or neither. And the morality of everyone within the world is so grey and interesting. Hey Nick, long time no see. So Nick played in my other campaign that I ran, which was a friendly local game store. And yeah, I agree with you. Bullet point lists are incredibly useful. And that brings me on to the next point that I had actually, which is consulting your notes. I am abysmally bad at keeping notes. I really am. And it's not because I don't want to, it's because I'm already thinking about the next thing and I tend to forget to stop and actually record what's just happened. Fortunate in that my memory for events is quite good. I don't necessarily remember all of the finer details, but I can remember pretty well the majority of the story that we've done for the last year and a half. My memory is quite good like that. What it's less good at is remembering those slight details. So I rely on my party in order to record a lot of the smaller points that happen, the interactions with players, player names, that's NPC names, that sort of stuff. And it says, biggest issue with Symbaroum is overpowered PCs. That's the main problem. GM Guide covers it. You can limit XP, but it still happens. Yes. And the actual official way to deal with this to a point, as I'm sure you know, is by having a large number of NPCs. I've spoken to the game designers about this. That's kind of the best way to do it. They acknowledge that if you have the same number of players than you do NPCs in a combat situation, and the players' characters are quite high, then the power is quite high. They've got a lot of XP in them. Then 1-on-1, the players will always win. That's just the way it's weighted. But if you actually put those characters into a situation where they are at disadvantage, then it works better. And certainly Symbaroum is more weighted towards those scale combats, which is a pain in the arse because that's just not fun to track as a GM. But as far as I'm concerned, and I know everyone is different, Symbaroum is more a social game. It's more a storytelling game. And I care less about the physical battles, the confrontations, the fights, than I do um, about the actual politics and the law. And there's so much law, and that's the story that I am the most passionate about when I run Symbaroum. Um, Combat is pretty quick. Normally, it's going to go in your player's favour, but when it doesn't, oh boy, is it painful! Really painful. And yeah, keeping that advantage in the NPC's favour is the best way to control it, because they can only hit one or two or maybe three, characters at a time. If you've got a large number more characters attacking them, then they get more rounds in. So bearing in mind that your superpowered players might have an attack that can really muller someone and can take out a non-player character in one go, that's fine. If there are 3 times as many non-player characters than there are player characters, then it's only going to work for the first couple of rounds. Meanwhile, the other player characters will come in with advantage and do quite a lot of damage back at them. And most NPCs have got the ability to do serious damage in a single blow when you get to a certain level. Also, Neil says, give the NPCs abilities that negate PC abilities. Yes, exactly that. It can work really well. And planning who attacks whom. So, for example, if you've got someone who's really good at ranged attack and not so great at melee, put them up against a melee NPC, particularly if they're not expecting it. For example, if you can get them again in some kind of disadvantage, get them attacked from higher ground so that they, someone jumping off of a platform to give them an element of advantage as they are higher and therefore have advantage. Just gives them literally the drop on the person they're attacking, and will make it slightly more difficult for the player character to ward off. And if you've got several of them, it helps. It helps a lot. Notes. So we're talking about notes. I'm not very good at it, so I compensate for that, as I said, with tagging. So, as I said, labeling your books is really useful. In Symbaroum, I've got 2 books that I've labelled up, which are Wrath of the Warden, the first book, the one we're running from at the moment, and the core rulebook. And you can get an idea of what's here. So there's a little bit of everything. And so, for example, I know we're at the start of Act 2, which is here, and I know that we are actually about to go there. So I'm straight away going to be able to just jump to basically here, and that's where we are in the campaign. That's what I'm doing this evening. And PDF is really useful for Control F, finding the thing that's relevant if you're looking up a skill or ability or how an attribute works or something like that. Finally, talking to your party. Have an idea of where your party was, how they felt at the end of the last scenario. Make sure that they understand, reframe the situation you're in. If it's been 6 weeks, then they're going to remember bits and you're going to remember bits. Actually spend the time, spend 20 minutes, half an hour just discussing what happened last time. Think of it as everyone's gathering around that campfire at the end of a really horrible battle or a long journey. You think, hey, do you remember that time when... It's really useful, and it's something that I try and do. Now, I will admit that actually when we last talked about, my home group talked about the scenario that we're doing now, or the situation we're in now, a few weeks ago. So what we're going to do at the beginning of this scenario, beginning of the game this evening, is basically the same thing. We're going to spend about 20 minutes just recapping. A couple of players are really good at referring to their notes and writing their own notes. So actually having them recant what they recall, particularly if they're very good at doing it in character, is a really good way of reframing where you're at. Also from the GM perspective, then having just reread the scenario and remembering how it should have gone because you've just done that, having your players then tell you what they remember and you not really coaching it unless you really have to, is a really good way to take a barometer of how the scenario has gone. Finally, have fun. If you mess up what you're doing next, doesn't matter. You can normally retcon it. You can come back to it a following scenario and fix it, either by correcting it. Most players don't mind if you say, hey, actually, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have done this. We should have done this. We've had a couple of rules questions where we've had to do that, where I've messed up on the rules, or a player's messed up on the rules, mostly me, let's face it. And, you know, we kind of don't really care to an extent. We do want the rules to be correct, and I am someone who will look up the rules to check what they should be. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. We're there to have fun, or in Symbaroum's case, be kind of stressed, which is really what it's like. If you had a player character that was supposed to do something and someone else did it, or they didn't do it, move it around. Assign a task to a different NPC. Sorry, I meant non-player character there. Assign it to a different NPC, or have that NPC correct their actions in character. It all works. Anyway, that's how I come back to running a game after some time off, and a sort of general overview of how I play and run Symbaroum. I hope you've really enjoyed the show. I've had great fun. Thank you everyone who's watched and participated in the comments. I really appreciate it. So very quickly, thank you to Christo, Sanjuro, Neil, Andy, Millie. I've got Andy in twice on 2 different platforms. And Mariusz. Mariusz, I'm sorry, I missed your comment very quickly. I always use music through Discord bots when I play online. Everyone can turn the bot volume on the level they want. Exactly, that's a really good way of doing it. If you're using something like Discord where you can control that, it's really, really helpful. I have a passionate dislike of Discord because I kind of think that the quality is not great in my experience, and because I feel that other products are better if you're going to be streaming out. But everyone has a different opinion on that, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there. That's actually a really useful hint and very valuable. Thank you very much for that. Thank you also to Nick. Long time no see. Hope you're doing well, my friend. And Super Beast, hi and bye very quickly. So again, if you've enjoyed this, then please like, subscribe, follow, notify, whatever, you know, the buttons are down there. And finally, I hope all your dice rolls are better than mine. Although in Symbaroum's case, I don't have to roll dice. It's wonderful. One less thing to worry about. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.